Well, good. Okay, you're all set.
All right. I motion to open the ZBA meeting. Motion, second, vote. Aye, okay, we're in business. Okay, so the first thing is to approve the March 11th and April 8th minutes. Did anyone find anything weird on those or anything? No? Okay, so I motion to approve the meetings. Motion, second, vote. Okay, unanimous, pass. Okay, cool. Village board updates. Do we have any village board updates?
I don't think there's anything on the board, and the only update I have is, you may see that it looks a little different on the video. We've stopped using the bar because we've been having nothing but issues with it, and we're just using the owl, so that's why you may see it different there now. So it's a work in progress.
Okay. Anything from Director of Planning, Zoning and Code Enforcement? No.
That was basically it.
Okay, cool. All right, so the first thing, I motion to vote. Do we want to discuss the 16 Prospect Street? Or sort of like talk? We're just voting on it.
I mean, we're just voting on accepting what was written.
Yeah. Have you guys looked at the property lately? We asked him to put up some bushes and he already put them in.
Which board is it?
Yeah, so there's a line of bushes between the property and there, and then it looks like you're putting stuff closer to the road too.
Yeah, I put a bunch of arborvitae closer to the road, those will get like 20 feet, super wide. And then I put a row of bushes just right next to the basketball court, those will get like 6 foot. Fill a hog gap in between them, so eventually you can hardly ever see that.
Okay,
You might want to just look through the 4 conditions at the page 2 and 3. They were basically what you guys articulated to Emily, but just make sure that everything is worded how you intended it to be.
it looks good. So do we want to just vote on this or do we want a discussion? Okay. All right, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really pretty thorough, I would say.
Yeah, okay. I motion to vote on 15 Prospect Street. Motion and second, okay. All right, so, let's vote.
Roll call.
Yes.
Okay, Ian,
Aye.
Rob,
Aye.
Dustin,
Aye.
Cody,
Aye.
and Sean.
Aye.
Okay,
All right.
all set.
You're all set. You know, right here,
I
Bill?
will email you a sign, he'll sign it tonight and I'll email you a signed copy once it gets filed with the first.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much for the unit.
No worries.
Did the plan on so I left this, I said, I'm going to go do the decision. And they're like, do you need us to come protest? I was like, just
I think we're just an opportunity here, because,
don't bother your mom while I'm going.
I mean, we don't have a lot of protesting going on in New Paltz. We could use some more. That would have been good.
Yeah.
But we'd have to have another side too, like grumpy
There's
old people who
Yeah.
are like, we hate children.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, thanks guys.
Alright, all right, so I think we're gonna motion to talk about the interpretation of a basement.
Yeah, so I can give you a little background on this. So one of the things that this board, meaning the zoning board, is empowered to do through the code is to interpret the zoning code when there's a question from a village official, not like a member of the public can't come ask you guys to interpret, but the village board, in this case, the building inspector, is asking you guys to interpret this section of code. How it got here is we had a person come in and was considering doing something in a basement. And we started looking at the code. And he asked, what uses are principal permitted uses in a basement? We started looking at the code and realized there's no differentiation of the basement versus the first floor versus the first story. And so the section of code that we're asking you is on page 2 and 3. It's the part that's, what is principal permitted uses, and then asking further what, might be special permit uses. And then we included the definitions that we kicked around and sort of found somewhat relevant to the question. But we kept getting in a very circular thing. You know, Alex and I kicked it around for probably half a day, thinking about it, reading it, talking about it. And finally I said to him, I said, you know what? We got a really smart ZBA, we got a smart ZBA attorney. Let's send it to them and let them decide. So that's why we're doing this, because it's a very gray area. He probably could have made an interpretation, but I said, let's utilize the, you know, the process as it's intended. So here we are. David and I had a brief conversation about it today, and I sort of laid some of the details out. So I'll let David take it from there as to, you know, what you guys should do next, or, you know, we're not necessarily looking for an answer tonight. If you guys want to do some research, if you want to have David do some research, you could come back next month with a decision, just like you do any other decision. So, but that's the gist of the question is, what uses are allowed in a basement? And we're talking about unique uses, not say somebody's doing something on the first floor and they maybe have storage in the basement. That would be an accessory use. We're looking for a specific, distinct, individual use.
So in this case, this guy wants a different business functioning in the basement.
In a basement, yep.
Okay.
And
David,
it happens to be in the gateway district, but if you look at the gateway uses, it says refer to the B2. So that's why we asked the question for the B2, because that's ultimately what the code is.
David, do you have something have you looked at this at all, or you?
I have, and I haven't looked at it in huge depth, but I have looked at it, thought about it, and spoken to Mike about it. And so the question, for the board, for me, and the board, is whether you want me to sort of give my own, as I interpret it, or as I, you know, think about what the best way to move forward is in terms of my own decision, or do you guys know more about the code and more about the buildings than I do.
Yeah.
So the question is whether you guys want to use your own knowledge about this sort of thing and talk first, and whether they want to use me essentially as sort of to give the primary impression, which may shape what you're doing, or have you guys make your own thoughts, and then I'll bring it on for you.
So the business district, the big picture on the business district is that you have, on the first floor, you have commercial, and above that you have housing. So as it is built, that's what everyone's doing. Okay, the basements, no one in their right mind is going to build a basement intentionally to do something. It's too expensive. As far as a business.
Storage.
Yeah, and even that, all those are being built on slabs.
Yeah.
Like every single one of these structures that are going in are on slabs. Cause it's cheaper, like why would you wouldn't do that?
But this is a retro.
This is a retro, which and this is where I think that since the elected officials who decided to make this special business district didn't say anything about basements, I think it's because they were looking at, we want new builds to come in, and this is what we want them to look like. We want them to be this and this and this. The danger with us saying basements are okay is that then we'll get 3-story buildings with a basement.
Right.
And then that will become a 4-story building. And then we'll be sitting here getting into arguments over grade, like has already happened a million times because of
Height variance.
height variances and all this other stuff. Now, if someone wants to put something in the basement, they can come before us and ask us for permission to do it. So I think the easiest way to deal with this is to say you cannot build anything in a basement. And if you want to get around that, you can always appeal it. And you can come to us and we can look at it from a point by point, because the new construction is, if we say that you can put a basement in, now these are all gonna be story taller. They're gonna go up a
And
story.
you lose that, yeah.
Yeah, and the intention is very clear, like this business district, the intention of the business district is to build walkable communities that you walk off the street and walk directly into the first story. That's the intention. Okay.
Street facing all.
Street face, yes, everything has to do that. So what's gonna happen is if we say all of a sudden now you can build a basement and basements are now legal, we're gonna get all these odd things, which is not the intention that the legislative part of the village, who is elected, we're not elected, they were elected, they decided they wanted to do it that way. And they had a vision, and I actually like the vision. Like, I think the buildings that we've gotten put in so far have done that. If we all of a sudden say now you can have a basement, we're not gonna get that anymore.
To speak to that, I think it's important to the fact that we're not talking about the one building that this was brought up about, we're talking about all of them.
Yes,
And I have no problem discussing case by case. In fact, I like it because it helps us be able to make sure that if there's something weird that's happening, that it can stay in the vision of the village's intentions versus just utilizing the code, you know, to basically do whatever you want.
I mean, this is a special business district. You know, this whole thing, and the people who are already there, like, are free to come to us and say, hey, we want relief from this, our basement just happens to be perfectly set up. Like, look at this, it was always like this, we're not gonna be doing anything weird, and we can say, yeah, sure, go for it.
Yeah,
You
I
know?
can't think of a single building where there's like a basement that's used for a commercial space, right? Is there or no?
Well, I mean,
The Scratch
Scratch Chapel, we gave a variance to, it's technical,
Is it technically a basement?
by these definitions, it is. It's.
Yes,
It is
technically more
than
That's, I mean, I'm trying to think of, I don't,
Well, my
also,
point is,
There's not many.
your point, and I agree with, I believe, is that I have absolutely no problem anytime someone has a basement and wants to do something with it, to decide case by case.
And this is only for non-accessory.
Be for non-accessory, because an accessory use is an allowed use under the code. If it's an accessory use to the first floor, then it's just part of the use. And
So then you get like bistro,
Yeah.
like those all have basements, they issue them as even Lola's as a basement.
yeah,
yeah, in this particular situation, I didn't want to get too much into the specifics because your guys are ruling on the code. But it is a basement that has high ceilings, is a finished basement, has access, so he's looking, but your interpretation of having it come to the ZBA is not a bad one.
yeah,
I think, like, I would have I know the building that we're talking about, and I would have no problem having him come and tell us what his intentions are and making a decision based on the use.
yeah.
And.
And I don't think this is gonna be something that's gonna happen very often.
There's not many, and I had never thought, Sean, about people actually building with a basement, and I was only trying to think of places where a basement could be used. And there's probably less than a handful
Yeah,
that I'm aware of.
yeah, I mean, if you can't put living space or in a basement, no one does it. Because it's costly, it's costly.
Yeah.
You just rip, you dig down a foot before a slab, you're done. No one does a basement on a professional space unless they have to.
Not to mention, almost all of the district we're talking about, the properties are partial marshlands and wetlands.
Yeah.
We're gonna be- if you were trying to build a basement on any of those.
Yeah, that would have been, yeah, but I think this is the other thing too, and this is just my thing. I've never been in a basement and been like, this is awesome. I always feel creepy in those spaces and stuff, I have an aversion to basements like this. I don't think that's like.
One thing you might wanna consider is just, in terms of residential use, instead of, and this is just, I'm just throwing this out as theoretical. If somebody wanted to do a residential use in the basement, would that be allowed? And I'm asking that as a question, not that I have an opinion one way or the other. Because we're all sort of thinking commercial, because that's what's being.
I think anything they wanna do in the basement,
At all.
that's not at all. I mean,
That's not an accessory.
that's not an accessory use, yeah, cause I mean, I think if they wanted. The people who are elected, who made that decision on that, how that district was gonna be, they thought about it. And they had a vision, and I think the vision is happening, and I think for us to open up the basement. Would clutter that, because then they're going to try to put a basement in, and now you're not gonna have that. We've all been to the city where you have to walk up, walk down.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking of, I'm like,
Like, that's only works when your square footage costs are $1 billion a foot, you know?
Kind of strange or rare for towns to have that as an accessible option, but
Yeah.
it's also not written into our code for a reason. They didn't want it in defaults.
Yeah, I think they were,
There's such a handful of retros that opening it to the future just seems like a mistake. We'll just
Yeah.
deal with whatever already exists.
yeah.
And
So it's reasonable, I mean, if you wanna, if your building is on a slope, like.
I'm pretty
like
curious what the-
scary, that makes sense, to have space down there, that makes complete sense, but if your place is super creepy and doesn't make sense for the area, then, then I think it's a good thing for them to come to us.
I'm curious what.
Would they have to come to us for residential stuff as well?
Well, we didn't really discuss that because, that wasn't what was being proposed,
I mean, you brought that up in terms of.
Yeah, and I only brought it up because it just popped into my head while we were sitting here. I had never thought about it before because, like, for example, when I was in college, I lived in a basement apartment that was probably 3/4 underground and had these little tiny windows and, and it had access. So those are possibilities, and that's the only reason I bring it up is I didn't know if you guys wanted to make an interpretation only on commercial or non-residential uses, or if you wanted to do it across the board. And
I think it should be-
either one makes sense.
I think whatever approach we decide, it should be across the board, not just for commercial.
Yeah, the only reason is many residential uses don't have as strict, the codes are not as stringent on residential. Because there's an assumption that residential is allowed use. So,
Like say like Sean has a basement, if he's just using that as like a second living room or whatever, that's accessory?
well, that's different because he's not in the business district. This is specific to the.
Okay,
business
say
district.
it is in the business
Yeah,
district.
but if he is using it as a second, that's just part of his structure.
That's just part of the structure. So this would be if he then decided, hey, I'm gonna close this off and rent that out separately.
Yeah, because the building code is very different for commercial and residential uses.
Right. But I guess I'm just trying to, if we include residential.
Well, I'm just thinking like, if you have that scenario where somebody decides, oh, I'm gonna finish my basement to make it an apartment or whatever, and I put in a secondary access point, its own
Well,
access.
then they have to come to us, and it depends, that's different, because then it's viewed as residential, and it's decided as, if it's a change of the site plan, then it probably is going to the planning board to review.
Right.
Obviously, access codes and size of bedroom and all those residential codes that go along with it have to be looked at. You still have to meet all those, but those are part of the state building code, not the zoning code. This is strictly uses of property, not necessarily how they're used. if that makes.
But then if in the process of changing out a new apartment, they breach one of the other things, then it can come to us on that.
If you have an auxiliary apartment, is that considered commercial?
So the village board wrote the accessory dwelling units are not, and
Okay.
they're considered, and they are just a permit through the building department, you don't have to go to planning.
So the only time this would come up is if someone wanted to put professional space in their basement.
Right.
That's
For the most part, but a business could put, say, you know, the in the B2, the goal is commercial on the ground floor, residential above. Somebody could in theory wanna do residential below too. And I don't know how that would be viewed, you know, Alex would have to review the specific ask to see where it went, but.
Yeah.
Or, this is more a question
Yeah,
of what
I would like-
uses
I would like-
can be allowed in the
Sounds
basement.
right, I would like to just maybe just case by case.
Yeah, this, I feel like cause also the other complex thing that's gonna get thrown in here over time is the houses here are 100 years old.
Yeah.
So they all have like, everything is so weird that to like say like make a general rule is almost not right.
Well, this would only be for the B2 district,
Yeah.
not for the other.
But
I
it's
think
also,
David had some.
so you.
Yeah,
Even considering the benefit of opening up is really just clerical expedience that they wouldn't have to come to us and such a rare. Problem to have, but it really doesn't bog us down enough to just.
yeah, I would have no problem approving basements.
Okay, I want to throw a couple of things in here. First, I want to go through my linguistic, the words matter here. And it's a little bit different than what I think you guys are thinking about, number one. Number two, I just want to point out that if we just kind of don't do anything here, or what, there's no jurisdiction at this point for the ZBA to have it, other than the building inspector coming to you and requesting it. It's not like if somebody wants to quote unquote build in the basement, you guys could come up with a way that they have to come before you. If this goes through the way I think you're going, the only way they would come before you would be on a use variance, and that's not gonna happen, so. Cause that's not possible, unless they can't turn a profit without doing it. So before we get too into it, I wanna just go through the words, because ultimately that's gonna become very important. And it's gonna be a little bit disappointing. The first thing to understand is that I think the definition of a basement is not what you guys are thinking that it is, because it's counterintuitive. And I don't know whether you find it this way, but if you read it carefully, a basement is a portion of a building that is below grade to any extent, but to any extent, but up to half of its height. So it's gotta be at least half above grade, and the amount that has gotta be below grade is minimal. It doesn't have to be anything below grade. I think the word that they have used here is hardly below grade and more than half its height. So in other words, it's more above ground than below ground. How much more is up in the air, but up to everything, including, if you have to step down an inch going into it, it's a basement, according to this definition, an inch or one step, and it's gotta be at least halfway above grade. So that's point number one when you guys think about what do we wanna do in a basement. It may be a little bit different than what you're picturing. Number two, which is actually more important, and it's up to you guys. The critical regulation here are the use restrictions in the B2 district for different areas, let's say, different height areas, et cetera. And that regulation, which is on the first full page of the handout, actually the second page, does not mention the word basement. The word basement does not exist in the regulation that we're interpreting. So whether this is a basement or not is actually a separate question. The word that is critical here, the only word that I see, is first floor. That's the word in that regulation, is what happens on the first, the uses are allocated on the first floor and perhaps the floor above the first floor. The first floor. And unfortunately, first floor is not defined. So where I'm going with this is that depending on what it is, what we're thinking about as a basement, if it's only, let's say, 1 or 2 steps below grade, you might think of it as a first floor in the B2 district with all the things that we attribute to a first floor, which is, that's the part of the store that you see when you're walking by on the sidewalk and you have to walk in and maybe you gotta step down. If you have to step down, it could be under this word basement, which actually also has no other application in the code. And I discussed that one night today. So basement is defined, but it's not applied anywhere.
It's also,
The thing you're interpreting is whether it's the first floor. The fact that they said it's a basement, I'm not sure why. Maybe that means you have to walk down into it, but I'm not even sure how far. So the question is,
David, I'm just giving you one second, I just noticed there's a definition of cellar, which is the space of a building that's partly or entirely below grade, which has more than half its height measured from floor to ceiling below
okay,
the average. So a cellar is if it's mostly below grade, a basement,
which may be what you're thinking of.
yeah.
And so I don't know what this proposal is. They say it's a basement, so assuming that they're correct, we can assume that you have to step down somewhat going into it, but less than half of its height. So it's more than half above grade. And again, if you go back to the regulation here, the regulation is expressed in terms of a first floor. And so the question becomes whether this thing is a cellar or whether this thing is a basement under the code, which they're saying, does it constitute a floor? Is the first floor of this building necessarily something other than this? And what do we want to do with it? Because there's no specification for a basement at all. And that's where I start on this is how do those fit together with respect to the observations you guys are making, which might have been you may even think about a much deeper basement from the
The
conversation.
interesting thing too with the cellar is it's not counted by definition, it's not counted in the number of stories.
so,
And in fairness to you guys, this example may very well be a cellar and not a basement.
yeah.
So.
Well, Mike,
Are there codes, like what you said, that this conversation started because there wasn't a code explaining the use of the basement? Is that true for cellar also?
Yeah, there's no, the code that David just referenced just talks about the first floor. It doesn't talk about,
Mike,
It's almost like if you change
yeah,
the word
but-
to the basement
let's
itself.
let David finish.
if I may, the question you presented to the board is how are distinct uses of a potential basement proposed to be interpreted under the code?
Right,
So are we talking about a basement as defined in the code, which is something that you walk down into from grade, but not more than half of its height? Is that what this is?
and that's what I was just saying is, what we're talking about may very well, I would have to go back to Alex and get clarification. He was calling it a basement because that's what the applicant called it, but
Well,
now that I read the definition of
Also,
cellar,
that's the human.
it might be a cellar.
Yeah.
No, it's.
No, I
most
understand
humans-
what you're
most
saying.
humans wouldn't, if you have to walk down 3 steps to get into a storefront, most humans.
I know.
wouldn't call that a basement.
The structure he's talking about is a basement as humans would call it a basement.
So like cellar in other words.
Cellar, so in a
It
sense,
may be.
I'm not,
Yeah.
if you know the building, then I'll trust.
the first floor is ground walk-in from
The
Main
front,
Street.
from Main Street, but we're talking about not the
And
back.
everything else is below that.
And the left and the right, yeah, everything is
Yeah.
below, it's definitely a cellar,
More than half.
it's definitely a
So it's
cellar.
probably a cellar, so we could,
It's definitely.
yeah.
So that may play much more into what you guys' discussion was, which is when you're walking down now cellars, you're walking down deeper, and that may
So
carry.
cellar is half or more,
Below
basement is
grade.
half or less.
Oh,
Exactly,
Yeah, that is definitely more.
That's a
than-
cellar,
but
that's
but-
definitely, yeah.
the semantics of, in the code itself, neither one is addressed in the uses that could be allowed or not be allowed. So, whether it was a basement or a cellar, the question is still somewhat the same question is, are there any uses that you would consider allowed?
and the next thing to consider, if you want, and unfortunately, we haven't been presented with the real facts here, is that this is a large space. This is not like a cramped thing where somebody would go in there and this is a sizable
On the
space.
same property, there's apartments under the other building.
I don't
Yes.
think it's under.
Yeah,
Under the liquor store, there's.
under the liquor store, there's apartments that are accessed from a.
Well, and again, that's where residential may be viewed differently, or they predate, and that's, yeah.
So, okay, so we have a definition of a cellar, we have a definition of basement. Do we have a definition of a first floor?
No,
Okay, so maybe our job is to define a first floor.
They define it as a ground.
We have a definition of a ground floor, but not a first floor.
Okay, so maybe, so if we found out, if we defined what a first floor is, then,
well, let's be careful.
So we would have.
And I really want to step carefully here, because
I got you.
the definition of a, for some reason, what we're observing is that the definition section and definitions in it don't necessarily jive with this particular draft for whatever reason. I want to go through the ground floor for a second, because I want you to think about it.
okay,
Ground floor is defined. And again, there's no other, I don't know if there's any other use of the term, it's certainly not in this section, but ground floor is defined as the lowest floor of a building having its entire floor to ceiling height above grade. So if you gotta walk, if you're on Main Street and you gotta walk one step or two steps down to get into a storefront, it's not a ground floor because it's gotta be fully above grade. It's really basement.
that's a basement, okay.
Yeah, and the ground floor has got to be the first floor that's completely above grade. And so the question I want you to think about in terms of how to use ground floor is as you look at that, the regulations for B2 talking about a first floor, is a first floor necessarily a ground floor, meaning fully above grade? Could a first floor, in terms of the B2 district and the types of things you want to see on the street, how the regulation price, could it be a basement that is at least half above grade? And where you were going was, should it never be a cellar? Because a cellar is more than half below grade, and that's sort of how all these terms work.
I don't think either of them, I think a first floor should be the ground floor.
So
I think it should all be above grade, because that was the intention of that, all that
Well, let me ask you
legislation.
this, if you have a particular, like, thing that wants to be a storefront, but you, and I don't know if this exists, I'm just going theoretical, but you know the village better than I do. But if you have to step down 2 feet to get into it, if you're not gonna let that be the first floor, that's gonna be some sort of that's gonna be a basement thing that is undefined, there's no rules for it. You'd be here trying to figure out what they can do on this step down thing, and then the first floor would be something that you actually have to take a staircase up to. And the question is, how does the rule basically demanding the commercial on the thing that you see from the
Well, I
side?
mean, in looking at this, I don't know which section, but where it says mentions first floor, it's talking about, and I'm talking about in the B2 district, 5A1, for the first floor, the front of the building facing 299, North Chestnut Street or South Chestnut Street should be limited to retail and service business. So that, I mean, to me, that is, I know they're using the term first floor, that is the ground floor is, you know, I mean, they're somewhat synonymous in that case. I know they're two different, you know, there's no definition of first floor, but that's what the ground floor
The
is.
south side of, the south side.
Ground floor is completely, ground floor is more than half below grade.
No, the ground floor is ceiling to ceiling.
No, ground floor is
ceiling
first,
to-
the-
ceiling
above.
to, is
But
on grade.
here's my point, is that the south side of Main Street, by this definition, is all basements. Gourmet, like, just because you step up into them, they are partially below grade, because it just slopes up on the back.
That's why you need to be thinking about how you want
So like,
to.
all of the entire south side of Main Street is basements. Once you get
Right,
up,
but, and maybe the difference,
Into all those.
but it doesn't matter, because it doesn't say anything about that.
Tony, do you mean in the back or on Main Street itself, on the storefronts on Main
The
Street?
storefronts on the front, it says nothing about stepping up into them. It says that they're partially below grade and that more than
They're not
half.
partially, none of them are partially, they're all above grade.
No, we have the walking scenes, so you take a few
They're like
steps
this.
into them, the grade goes up.
When
That's
you're,
what I'm so by definition, that's a base.
the building's like this and this is your front door, the grade's like this. When you go
Think
behind
about
that,
that parking lot when you're driving up to back.
like think of like gourmet, that's a good example.
What?
Like gourmet pizza at that thing right there. Like where Oasis used to be.
Yeah.
Like you step up into it, but as soon as you walk into the building, you're a little
Yeah, but,
and that's how they're defining it.
Yeah,
but we're not, so,
that's crazy. That's just a really confusing definition.
well, and that's where it's saying a basement, if more than half is above grade, they're saying a basement is considered the first story.
But not.
But a cellar is not considered. Yeah, I just looked, the word, the definition for ground floor, I'm not sure why it's in the code, because it's not used anywhere else in the code.
Right, and there's no first floor, there's no definition of first floor, but if you look at that one section I see that I pointed out, that is in essence a ground floor.
Yes, part of the problem is as the code evolved, when they wrote this B2 and NDR and the gateway, where they talk about first floor, second floor, third floor, they used words that weren't defined, and they should have either defined them, or David will probably agree with this, if a word's not defined, you basically go look in the dictionary and see what the common.
Which would have been better if it didn't define basement, then we wouldn't be.
We could, here's what,
Cause that's just an
But
inaccurate.
in hindsight, I believe the building we're talking about is actually a cellar.
By this definition,
yeah, you know what we should do, my suggestion here, I think the words cellar, basement, and ground floor are all distractions here that are just gonna confuse everything.
Yeah.
We've got to interpret really the B2 use code. And so the question becomes, I mean, those words may be helpful to us, I actually think they won't be, but they could, but let's just set them aside. This particular proposal, which we probably ought to start with, is it the first floor of this building? And keep in mind, in making that decision, you know, the building's got its own first floor on Main Street. And then in the back, it's a different topography, different elevation.
It's
And-
not,
It's not?
no,
Not in this
they
case.
have a pit
Okay,
staircase to
so
go
then the
down.
question, I'd say the cleaner question,
maybe
It's definitely
a foot.
maybe a foot.
Okay.
It's definitely
stairs.
cellar.
3 stairs into the main level.
then the
Yeah,
question for,
it's
question
definitely
for this
so.
board, setting aside those other words, which I think are distractions, is under what circumstances, do you believe that area, that entering from the back, from the parking lot, I assume, would qualify as a first floor? And if not, is there any reason to impute any acceptable uses in it other than an accessory use for the ground, for the other floor, which would be storage or something like that? Could somebody stick an office in there? And would that make you happy or unhappy in terms of interpreting whether that can be considered a first
I
floor?
mean,
under this?
What, was it offices before?
It was offices for the bank, so it was accessory to the
To the
main
bank.
floor, because the bank was the entire building,
But the.
and they had offices in that area. I don't wanna
But
call
now
it
they
this.
want it to be a separate use and not put out.
I don't know how important or not important this is, but I just, like, quickly, what you were talking about earlier is, it seems like, once again, like, all of these definitions were written for the new area where it's completely flat. Like, all of the spots we're building out there are flat, you're not running into all.
I suspect these definitions may have come out of building code, but then when they wrote the zoning code, which was later. You know, this B code was amended in
That's right.
2021.
Yeah.
Definitions aren't, I mean, basement is not used anywhere else in the code, so I would just, it's just almost a fool's game to figure out what they are, because they don't apply here.
Right,
The question is that there are certain uses and certain ideas for the first floor and the floors above it. How do you want that to apply to the back of this building?
and we're calling that first floor for
This
this
is the
conversation.
code calls it a first
Okay.
floor. You gotta decide whether the first floor regulations, which specify the uses, and by the way, differently for the front and back. That's the other thing that the way this code is structured, is you've got different first floor uses for the front and back, which makes sense, because on Main Street, and on Chestnut Street, you're gonna want a different presentation for those storefronts.
Actually, the definitions, where the only place they come into play is in flood damage prevention, which is a whole nother animal.
Okay,
But it's part of the zoning code, so that's where they come
First
into play.
floor building facing the street, okay.
So then you go down this first floor.
so you got two sets of regulations here for the first floor, depending on if it's the front or the back. In this case, clearly it would be, I assume it would be the back. And so how does that proposal on the ground jive with this set of regulations, including whether this needs to be the first floor? Because they want to rent offices to it, and it's a sizable space, although you guys know how far down it is and whether you essentially want people in the village to be renting out offices for something at that grade level, and also, but also give them the size.
We don't actually know that it's offices, right? We weren't told the use for this because it's irrelevant.
No,
You know?
he's not necessarily proposing offices, the question we received is, what uses can I do there? And then he threw out, could I do an office? So, but he's asking it in reverse, is he wants us to tell him
Right,
what are the allowed uses there? And then he's gonna try to find a client
Yeah.
based on that.
So what uses do you want in the
So
space?
then why do we have to do this? I mean, what is wrong with saying to the individual, tell us what you propose, and we will let you know if it's permitted? I mean,
Well,
why?
because why we're doing this is the code is completely silent, so no matter what he proposes.
Well, I'm not saying simultaneously looking at that, but my only thing is like giving somebody a list of, like, tell us what you want, and I agree with you that we simultaneously.
case by case.
In this lane, we need to be looking at that, but like, tell us what it is that you're looking to do, and then, you know, evaluate it on a case by case.
Well,
basis.
so,
You said that that was not possible in,
It's like-
in your review, why?
Yeah,
why
because,
you-
I mean,
because it's a use variance.
Because-
well, yeah, well, number one, it could be, you know, they come here, I mean, how do they get here? It's a use variance, number one, or they come in for interpretation, but here's the thing. You can get away with interpreting it categorically, like, just for the sake of argument, it is a first floor, then the uses are given. There's nothing, remember, the basic rule here is that the ZBA can't legislate. So what we're talking about here in many cases is by interpreting the rules, you actually do some very minor legislating for a particular case under a particular rationale, but you're not legislating overall. If you were to try to create a scenario where somebody would have to come into you under some rationale, presumably some rationale other than a use variance, you're basically regulating that you basically determine uses on a case by case basis, and that's not what the ZBA does.
But I also like, I mean, I guess my concern is we are in a way legislating here. I mean, it's not our job to define some of these, you know, you're asking us for an interpretation of something that's not even, that the code is silent.
Well,
Right, and
That's a problem for me.
But that
In
is-
essence, we are making legislation.
that is- but that is exactly why it goes to the ZBA to interpret what the code and what David
The code
said.
the code is silent though.
Well, typically,
Exactly.
if a use is not permitted, specifically permitted, it's prohibited. That's,
So,
you just keep it.
so right now it's prohibited.
That would be-
Yeah, keep it prohibited, and then like if they want a variance, then you have
but
to.
you
But then they have to apply for a use variance, which they will not
Use
get.
variances are nearly impossible to get. In order to get a use variance, they gotta show that there's no positive return on property without it. So people don't even bother.
The property as a whole or the segment property?
Usually the property as a whole, now, if they wanna come and say, I can't get a return on my basement, they haven't really invested, I mean, that's a good question, I don't know.
I mean,
that's
that,
a-
you wouldn't be able to make money if you couldn't have a business.
See, I think the way David was asking the question, so if you look back at, you know, what we supplied, it says for the first floor, these uses are principal permitted uses, and these uses are special uses.
Which is special.
And the
And that-
question really that we're asking is, whether it's a basement or a cellar, anything below the ground level floor, which is completely above, how would this board consider it? And that's really what we're asking is.
I go back to say, I don't know how I would consider it, because there's nothing to base it on, there's nothing in the code, and that's why I think we are in making certain decisions, we would be legislating here where there's nothing.
David's not wrong, you are legislating to a degree because the code is silent. You
So the silence means that it's
can
prohibited.
say.
Well, if the code is silent, then the presumption is
Well-
prohibited, it's that the use is prohibited.
The question is whether it falls into the category of a first floor.
Well, first of all, I don't know what we're talking about, I don't know the building we're talking about, there's. so
That's
many-
okay, because you're not supposed to be
Okay.
talking about a specific.
Well, some of us do, some of us don't,
Yeah.
and so, but I'm saying to you is if I understood you correctly, if something is silent, then the use is prohibited, correct?
Generally.
Presumption is prohibited.
That's correct.
Let's keep it,
So
so,
how
But
how many,
But can I just interject
Yeah.
for a second? This is not about a particular use. This is, the question is being,
what?
really so the first question is the basement and cellar also considered the first floor or not considered the first floor? That's really.
I would say
the first
no.
question.
I know.
And then the second question is, if it is considered the first floor, then you don't have to go beyond that, because if you guys consider it the first floor, the code now answers those questions.
And the other thing too is,
Such a gray area, because by these definitions, if you say that the basement isn't the first floor, then half of Main Street falls.
Well,
but that's all.
But bear in mind,
Matter. This would only matter if you stop.
We can't interpret the word
Cody,
ground
there-
floor
there-
to say it's the first floor, but rather
definition
so
of
to be
basement,
amended to.
it says the basement shall be counted as one story. So
Right.
if it's more than half above, so, you guys could determine that, okay, a basement that meets this definition, that is part of the first floor, but a cellar that meets this definition is not part of the first.
So how
Does that make sense?
most of this district is going to be compliant.
Yeah.
How many unique situations, like in this case, the options of a building that there's two businesses on the top, like legal floor, and there's a basement. The options, if nothing changes, is he can't put anything in them and they sit completely empty.
Or they get used as accessory.
To one of these businesses though.
Correct.
So he's wanting a third
Use.
source of income.
And again, it's not about this particular case, but
Yeah,
in this case, it is
It
sizable.
is, because it's because that's what's being, this is what's reciprocating this, so it is on this, and I understand there's greater questions that apply to the
Right.
larger
But
code.
your ruling is gonna carry over to any,
Which makes it feel so
Application.
legislative.
Yeah, I mean, I think that,
I like that
Let me-
silent limit.
there's a
Yeah,
rule,
I was leaning towards trying to figure something out, but now
It doesn't seem like any reasonable solutions don't entail amending the code.
Well, that's-
The code can't
well, the
use
only
words
thing
that
you
doesn't
guys,
define itself.
if you did
So
want
they
a
can
rule that,
combine ground floor and first floor, they can come up with a definition for the word first floor, but more or less we can't interpret the definition of a word that the town foolishly used without defining first.
but you
you
could,
can, I mean, you don't want to.
but what you guys could decide is the other proposal that I just asked, which is a basement the first floor and a cellar isn't? If you guys came to that conclusion, that would, because then a basement by this definition, which is the zoning code, which have more, that would
yeah, but then
cover,
we might, but then there's
that
also,
covers the situations that you're talking about.
but
Cody.
then we're gonna have buildings that are illegal. Because if we count the basement on Main Street on some of those structures, they're gonna be too tall. And so then if they ever wanna change anything, they're gonna have to like rip stories off of them. We're gonna create the exact.
No, they won't have to, because they're pre-existing non-conforming. They're.
Right.
If you guys
Yeah, unless they wanna
interpret this now-
change some future construction.
Yeah, if you guys interpret this now, those buildings are.
Right, but of course, it doesn't.
You're never gonna have to take them away.
Trying to decide if a basement or a cellar are the first floor, then we're crafting a definition for the word first floor, which is not our job, it's the town's job.
Is,
Well, your job is to interpret and predict, well,
To interpret, but not to write.
It's to interpret, but we're not, there's nothing to interpret. That's.
Yeah, we're not interpreting, we're writing a new definition.
no, I mean, I was, the basement is a problem. The question is, does this, I would focus on this, I disagree with where Mike's coming from, because
Yeah, I mean,
most case decision makers are looking at a concrete situation and it helps you make your decision. Now, your decision, just like with the court, this is the same as with the court. Your decision, even though it's on a particular case, can apply elsewhere, and we see this all over the place in the cases that are in the news. National law, I mean, the courts are not supposed to make law, but there are national rulings and national injunctions that apply from a particular case, including even abortion, a particular stage of the pregnancy or anything else that comes up. The court, in fact, this is important to realize, a court, federal court, will always rule on a particular matter. Federal court will not give advisory opinions. It's in constitutional law going back to the year one, and they must rule on a case in controversy, which means a particular, that's why you have to have standing, for example.
Right, but isn't that they're also looking at a specific fact pattern?
That's what I mean.
Right, we don't have a fact pattern.
That's what I mean. So you may, the village here is doing you a disservice because they're coming in and saying, starting from scratch in terms of what this means in the abstract and generally. Whereas you would typically be benefited by looking at a particular case, trying to make a ruling on that, and then also thinking at the same time, if we rule that way on this, how does that affect the broader situation?
Which
So you
we've
do-
done before.
That's right, and you have to, but the point is, at least you have a particular case to begin to focus on. And what I would suggest is forget about what a cellar and a basement is, except as a shorthand. And I'm gonna ask you this, in order for the first floor rules that are before us to apply to a particular situation, let's just start with the front. I know this is probably the back, but let's just start with the front. If you want the rule on first floor to apply, how low below grade is allowable? How many steps are allowable to go down into a storefront before you will acknowledge that it's a first floor with all the rules for uses on the first floor that are right here? Is it zero? Must you step up, or can you step down one step?
Well, it's complicated building by building, so the front doors here, the back doors here, the grades
How
here.
much you step down into.
Like,
So,
You don't have to step down at all for it to be partially below grade.
you could step up into a building and still be stepping into
below
like grade, you know, if the
How?
front door's here,
If
the
it's on a
back door's here, then the grade is here.
well, let's take either side, the front or the back. Let's just start, pick one.
I mean, the grades.
But the building, the grade's the same regardless. So
But the
if
grade is
Well,
building by the average of
the
four.
building's on a,
Four.
if a building's on a 45-degree hill, right?
Okay,
So this is our building. If you walk up 3 steps
from the.
from the street, from the main street, right? But then, and this is Main Street. Then that's a hill. That
So you're
goes,
saying you're walking into the hill, basically.
yeah, which you're doing on half of our Main Street. And all of the left side of Water Street Market.
So we would all call that first floor, ground floor, but it's also a basement.
So let me back up. In a situation like that, you're taking a step up, you're essentially walking into a hill, so the back of whatever you're walking, the back of the store you're walking into is
Below grade.
below grade, at least to some extent.
Right.
That's a situation. You're at store X on Main Street. Do you want the first floor rules to apply to that situation? Do you think that they should and do?
I would call that a first floor, ground floor, so
Forget it.
it would.
I think that's what I think.
And I think they do because they may have access
Right.
from the other side that is ground floor.
Okay, so your point of view is if you're stepping up, no matter what's happening behind you, if you're stepping up, you're gonna be on the first floor.
But I don't like that for future building.
Yeah,
Yeah, the stepping up or stepping down is too vague of a definition to work with.
Because the way the definition works, grade is also an average.
there's no, there's no grade in this definition.
No, I mean grade in code.
Yeah, but we're trying to put.
So
grade
my
in this
question
definition.
That's where
for-
building code
My
comes
question
into
for the
play.
board is,
So-
what situations physically, that, including the things you're thinking about, including this one, fit into the provisions for a first floor here? And the first floor, remember, there are specific uses that are allowed for the first floor and different specific uses allowed for the first floor in the back. And clearly the village board was thinking about certain presentations, certain uses, certain things when they drafted this structure. And so my question to the board is, if you walk in at grade, and it's always at grade, it's obviously the first floor. If you have to, even if you're stepping up, if you're stepping into essentially a grade, you still want it to be the first floor, is what we were just saying. If you step down a step or two, and even forgetting what's going on in the back, up, down, or indifferent, if you have to step down 2 or 3 steps to go into a thing on Main Street or Chestnut, do you want that to be the first floor in terms of the way the code structures it? Because what I'm ultimately driving at is, do we want this thing that we kind of know what it is, some of us know what it is, although I know what it's identified as, but I don't know the physical nature of the back here. Do we want this thing to be a first floor within its structure? And also think in terms of what does that mean for the rest of things? That's where we're at.
We're not supposed to be talking about a unique case, but in this unique case, that is not a first floor.
You don't want that to be a first floor.
It's,
No.
this is where I struggle.
Well, tell me what.
Because the definition that I'm being forced to use is, I would call like a mistake,
Which one?
that basically.
But you're not,
that's why I can't even tell you my reasons, because my reasons are that it's a basement.
The only
but it's also
reason-
Not a basement.
The only reason why the word basement is here is because the village has chosen to throw it in.
Right, and but that's what the issue is that when you say, why isn't that first floor? My answer is because it's a basement, but it's also not a basement because of the way these
Supposed
work.
to tell you this, when Alex and Mike called it a basement, if they were going along with the code, what they really think for your purposes, because I want to throw the word out. They're thinking about, a space that is somewhat submerged, or whatever the right word is. Subterranean, but not more than half subterranean. Somewhere between 0 and half that's the space that's the only thing that's
Not more than half.
Not more than
Less than half.
less than half subterranean.
This is also tricky because now we're not actually talking, like, this question hasn't actually been asked because this building is
Well,
more than half.
And I just noticed too, in the B2, it says, number 1 says for the first floor, the front of the building, and then number 2 says any portion of the first story not
Yeah.
facing Route 209.
That's right.
So
And
they
story.
kind of screwed up in that they both should say story, not first floor. Because then that would solve the problem, because the basement being more than half above the grade says by definition, that's the first story. So,
Whoa, wait, where
Use
you
of
get
the
that
word-
from, Mike?
But the use of the
But
word
this
first
thing is
story.
so if you look at,
Subterranean.
if you
There
look
is a definition of
at
first story, the first.
the principal permitted uses, item number 1 says for the first floor.
It's a little.
And then item number 2, it says any portion of the first story. And what would have solved this
It comes down.
dilemma is if item number 1 said for the first story instead of for the first.
What is the definition of first story?
Where is that?
Well, we need the-
So if you look at the definition of
So
basement,
if something's classified as. a
or the
story,
definition of story,
What counts as a story?
it's on the next page.
And then.
So like a seller wouldn't count as a story. if the building-
So it says in a basement, it counts as the first, as 1 story,
To get.
a cellar does not.
Okay.
Okay, I got it. All right, I didn't know.
No, I'm looking at the definition.
Between one floor level.
It says basement shall be counted as one story.
But that's.
So my point is, in going back to where the uses are allowed, if they use the word story rather than floor, this would all be resolved. And then maybe the answer, that I go back to the village board and say,
It's not resolved. It's
What?
within both.
Or if they remanded it to the word ground floor
Okay, let's,
instead of first.
we gotta work through what Mike just said, because I don't see it, but he does, and if we can see it, then maybe that resolves it. Suppose section 5, subsection 5A1, instead of giving us a specification.
instead of saying,
Let Mike.
5A1,
let me speak.
Okay.
Instead of specifications for the first floor, just suppose it said for the first story. Now, Mike is saying therefore that solved the problem, but I don't see it, so I
the
want.
reason I say it solves the problem is if you read the definition of basement, it says a basement is the first story.
The space of above, where does it say first story?
The very last sentence of the definition.
A basement shall be
Counted,
counted.
one say first story, but
It
it's
doesn't
a
say-
story.
It doesn't say that at all.
In the basement definition, the last
Yeah,
line,
that's-
a basement shall be counted as 1 story.
That doesn't make it the first story.
No,
Yeah,
it's counted as one story.
There's no stories below.
There's no stories below, it has to be the first.
So if there's a cellar below it, it doesn't count as a story, therefore the basement is the first story regardless of grade.
Thank you.
Because it says it's counted in stories.
That comes out where I sort of was, but I'm not convinced, because we're changing all kinds of words around, and now we're changing one story to the.
No, but I'm saying that may be the fix for the village
No,
board.
because a story. Okay, that's what you guys want.
No, I'm just saying, that is
Listen,
my.
I think, okay, so
Yeah.
now, all right,
I want
You guys can go
to
back
change
to
the
the-
definition of basement.
I think- okay, so I
The
think,
village has to add one definition to the code and then the problem's
You
resolved.
guys can come back and say,
Yeah.
you can't decide.
so
for
this is, I think where we need to go first is we have to, what I would like to see is if Dave could go through the stuff and see the definitions of cellar, basement, and first floor, and see if there's anything, and ground floor. Those are the four terms. If those got defined for us, right, then we could look at it and maybe make a
Well,
little
three
better
of them are,
decision.
three of them are defined, they have to understand how to use. I mean, you're looking at the definition for basement, story, and ground floor, they're right there.
Oh, this is confusing.
But none of the- My
Multi-story.
point is, none of those definitions are used in the section we're
Yeah.
we're interpreting a particular section. And the only reason why basement is here is because that's what Alex and Mike chose to call this, but it's not helpful to us. The real question is whether this particular proposal complies with the regulations for a first floor or not. And if it doesn't, whether it just therefore drops off because there's no provision for it.
I don't think I can get behind that first story, first floor thing because of the definition of.
What proposal, or what is it?
This is a proposal
Well, but, yeah.
for office use.
I can just say for me, I'm not ready to make any decisions. I know what it is.
If we say that this is the first floor. It now is a multi-story.
It's right there. Well. In the back it is.
But it says. So we're saying that if it's 2 floors, then we're counting those as floors, that's what story said we have to do. But then it says that a multi-story building is a structure having more than 1 floor above grade. And that doesn't.
Well, what does above grade mean?
That's according to the code, so.
No, multi-story would be 2 stories above grade.
Above grade, that's what I'm saying, if we say that that's 2
But
floors,
this is not totally above grade.
if we're saying. That's what I'm saying, if this doesn't work.
Right.
A building that has 2 stories can be not defined.
If we say that that's the first floor, and we can do any of those first floor uses, then it's also a multi-story building. And it's not a multi-story building if it's
But
not,
that thing we're calling first floor is not above grade. It's partially above grade.
yeah, but to say first floor, second floor, but it's not multi.
Yeah, you have to, it has to be
We
2
can't-
stories above ground for it to be multi-story.
Fully above.
Yes, well, it's not.
And it's not, yeah, so it's not a multi-story, it's a 1-story.
It's a one story with multiple.
It's a 1-story.
One story,
It's a
two,
1-story.
two first floors. Where you come out. You have a first floor in the back.
And one of them's completely subterranean, so whatever.
Well,
Then it's not a that's not what.
It's a seven.
With two.
so basement would be above grade.
Partial, more than half.
And the
Yeah.
multi-story doesn't say that both floors have to be fully above grade. Having more than one full, more than one, yes, it does.
More than 1 full floor above average grade, according to the
So
code.
it's not a
Well,
multi-story.
No, it's not a multi-story.
The thing I was talking.
Right, so it's not, both floors are not fully above grade.
How about this? This is, Mike, did you say that you thought this thing was really a cellar, this particular one?
I believe it to be.
So
yes.
one way to get through this is just to say, if it's a cellar, meaning it's more than half below grade, it doesn't fall into, it doesn't even come, it's not even eligible in any interpretation to be the first floor, nothing is allowed, therefore nothing is allowed.
That would,
Yeah, so in
that would help.
this situation, that's a floor, like, let's just assume that it is.
I
think we could make very certain cellar. If it's a cellar, then no one's asking us any questions.
Correct.
Well, they are, asking, Dennis.
We are, but if we get to the cellar part and we get half an answer.
You're into the-
and we solve the question.
But I mean, for like a cellar, no one's saying that a cellar should be able to be used for anything.
That's what they're asking,
That's what he's trying.
Now,
yeah.
so is this gonna come back to us and be like,
We don't know.
what?
I would feel very comfortable ruling on a cellar being, because the cellar is half or more. So that means if you're trying to put. I can't think of anywhere where anything in the village where a cellar would be built on rationally. Maybe basement would be like, oh, that could half up the hill, but not a cellar.
The only way they could come back to you is, as David said, for a use variance, because,
They won't.
but you guys,
Yeah, you can't do
you
that.
guys could rule that the cellar is not the first floor, and that would help us.
Well, that's where it's a little tricky, is because I don't necessarily on an individual basis have a problem if there being something in this space, but.
Remember, but by anything, you mean a new use, that's actually paying rent and inviting the public in. In one form or another.
I think they've run out of fire, anyway.
Well, but that's a whole separate story.
I don't think it's gonna be done, there's not like, nothing to eat,
And
right?
that, then the zone is consistent with the fire code, isn't it?
Yeah, I think in general, sellers shouldn't have public in them.
Like, does it have windows?
I don't think, I can't think
There's
of.
no requirement.
Like,
Well, I
I've
know,
been in, like, I've been in Manhattan where they build in the cellar, and it's dangerous, but they do it because the cost per square foot is so high. I don't think we fall into that category here in the village of New Paltz where the property value is so valuable that you're gonna dig down and put stuff in there. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, it's not, like, we're not in that kind of situation where that would make any sense. So the only time this is gonna happen is a really contrived kind of way.
So basement is the first floor and the cellar is not.
Well, you don't
I don't think
You have
you
to
say
say
that,
that,
I think you just say a cellar, a cellar is not a first floor. And you.
That's all, you can stop right there, you don't have to go down.
Cellar is not a first floor.
So bring it
And I think
around,
we can agree on.
well,
The cellar is not a first.
Yeah, it's still weird to use the link.
But we have cellar as a definition.
Right.
So as defined in the zoning.
Yeah, as defined.
and code, it's really about sellers.
Yeah.
And the next step that I think you guys are thinking about and proposing is that our interpretation is that under no circumstances would a cellar be eligible to be considered a first floor, because this is the B2 use table.
Yes.
That would,
Sounds
yeah.
great.
Is that where we're
Yeah,
going?
and I'm happy to represent
I mean,
the department right
well-
now and tell you that
Grant-
we made an error and it's a cellar.
Grandfather aside, because there is one, like, I
That's-
can think of an example.
That's a whole other
Example of a business.
Well, then you just need a non-conforming use.
Right,
Yeah, but don't
which
think
is
that's gonna
fine,
come
it's
up.
the non-conforming.
And I wanna
use is not
just-
free.
It's not a new proposal.
Another building.
I wanna make two other points.
No, that's a basement, because half of it's exposed, half of it's not.
Exposed isn't the definition.
The cellar can be exposed.
I'd be deeply
That's
surprised
one
if that wasn't more than
but
half below grade.
If 100% of the walls uncovered,
But the.
yeah, then
but
that
the
would be.
grade- the grade is also-
Elaboration, then you slightly
Yeah.
below
If
grade.
it's straight is grade
About
level,
65% of the buildings.
and, yeah, that's,
Office is
that would
grade.
fall into.
Well, here's
Most existing.
David's got two other.
a couple of things. First of all, whatever we do, especially if we don't, if we do something that keeps where you want this thing to go, this particular thing, but if we've made some, if there's some law that then gets, another thread gets pulled out somewhere because just because of the cockamamie way the code is written, if the village board is dissatisfied with the overall settlement, the village board can re-legislate the whole thing, and they probably should, so, we should keep that into account. The second thing I wanna ask, particularly coding, because you were looking at the facilities, the establishments on the south side of Main Street, and I presume more in the back than in the front, but I'm not even really sure. Does what we would say, does it mess any of those things up by saying, if it's a cellar, then we're not even gonna consider this being ground floor, and you don't really have any allowable uses?
For starters, all of those would be non-conforming pre-existing.
Until one of them leaves and you need to get a special use do you guys get site plan approval if something in that district leaves and then a new business comes in, a bookstore leaves
Right.
and a restaurant comes in, does that problem pop up then?
They would be close enough to where I would need a surveyor to tell me whether or not it's a basement or a
And
cellar.
again, you can move forward with it, even if you have these concerns, and if the village board doesn't like it, they can come in and just redo the whole
Mike,
thing.
do you know, is, Water Street Market in this district?
Probably.
Right, so. It's hard to define how they would define.
Are there any
grade.
uses there that would be in its cellar, more than 50% below grade?
It's exactly, yeah, it's the second floor is ground level, the first floor is ground level, so it is 50%.
Yeah, but it doesn't cover 50% of it. It's because you remember how long that building is. You have all that wall space going back.
Yeah.
The entire building you're talking about,
Yeah.
not the individual
Yeah,
cellar.
well, no, but it's one continuous building.
So you're looking.
So it wouldn't matter because there's so much open space.
In that case, the entire structure is what, yeah.
And then it has a second floor for part of it, so then that would change the percentage above grade.
Yes,
Correct.
Yeah.
it also has two legit swings. What?
I'm cool.
Okay, yeah, I think we're coming, so why don't you write up?
Okay.
I motion to have you write up that a cellar is not a first floor. Or no, a cellar is not,
Yes, that's right.
A seller cannot be.
a cellar cannot be a first floor.
And also acknowledge.
Intelligent seller is defined in the zoning code.
Right,
Yes.
please,
Yep,
as defined,
yep, done,
yeah, cause cellar,
And acknowledging that we're talking about a cellar here, not a basement,
Yes.
as they wrote us.
Yeah.
yeah, a cellar as defined, right.
Yeah, and as a representative of the building department, I'll make that correction from our request that it is a cellar, not a.
Yeah.
And then if the
We
developer
want to take
or
it
the town,
further.
but if anybody doesn't like it, particularly this particular developer or the village, they can just go ahead and legislate differently, because they've left us with a code that's very hard to deal with.
Right.
Particularly, it's.
Yeah, the correct move is to change.
And the village is working on tweaks to the zoning code right now, and I'm believing all these notes are,
That, yeah, cause that's just.
so, yeah,
Okay.
all right,
okay,
Who
I
made that
motion, so we motion to have them,
yeah,
do we have to vote on that?
yeah, you should.
Okay,
Authorize Dave.
motion to authorize Dave to write up what we just said.
Okay, do I have a second?
Second, okay, vote.
I
Okay,
can just do, yeah.
yeah, we got 4-1.
Favor?
Say,
Okay,
Okay, so it's 4 and Roberts.
okay, he's just gonna vote.
I just don't know what we're talking about, I like a little bit, I'm not comfortable on it.
You're used to it, you're used to following laws around the.
No, it's, you have a fact pattern, I mean, we're basing some of this, a large portion of this discussion is based upon a fact pattern. Of an individual who's looking to use a basement, a cellar, whatever it is for a purpose. And I think having that fact pattern is important, especially when we are making decisions that not only pertain to that, but have a larger context. Like you said, use the court as an example. They have a fact pattern, they look at that, and then we weigh what the repercussions of those decisions are. I'm not comfortable making a decision with this imaginary stuff, so that's why I'm
That's fine.
saying,
Yeah,
I just don't like the way you're saying.
yeah, well, unfortunately, that's how it is handled, though, it is imaginary, because.
It's not imaginary because we are working, you're referencing a specific place. It's not imaginary, you're referencing a specific place in the village. And the fact that, we're not talking about the specific place. Like
Well, some of
I said, I don't know, that is a problem.
Some people were, because they knew what it was, and you were just.
But that's why we worded it, the way we worded it, and trying not to reference.
I think you should.
Cody and the chair would have had more difficulty reasoning through this, if they were not aware of what this was, and the board should ask for the pattern that either Alex is thinking about or that the applicant is thinking about, because.
I also have a problem with the fact that an applicant is saying, well, what can I get away with? Like, I mean.
No, it's not what can I get away with, it's what can I legally
What
do?
can I use?
And actually, we would rather have they do that.
Okay.
If they come to us and say, what can I do, rather than they come to us, we go, no, you can't do that.
I would hate for it to
I'm
not.
more comfortable with an applicant, to me, this is what they're looking to do, this is what the code is, as I said, there's no fact pattern here to make a decision.
Well, I mean, we're specifically when the code doesn't say what we wanna know.
All reasonable solutions involve inventing or remanding a definition.
Yeah.
Particularly the village board might want to consider a definition of first floor for use in that section, and also maybe add some other things, yeah.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Okay,
All right. Motion to close the meeting? Okay. Good. Motion. Have a good night, guys.
See you over there.